We saw what mainstream media got us, so that's why it's so important to support alternative media like Act Out. To become a patron of our show, this independent activist news show, Act Out, visit patreon.com/actout. This week, looking at the road ahead, we gotta focus, think, unite, and act. And I hope you haven't forgotten about the action challenge that I mentioned last week. Here are a couple of ideas that aren't necessarily geographically specific. Next up, capitalists, a capital miss. Finally, the Next System Project is researching, developing, and implementing alternatives to our current system and wants to hear your thoughts on the subject. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Before we move on to the rest of the show, I'd like to say two things about the quagmire that we find ourselves in after last Tuesday. One, now is the time to unite the left. And here's what I mean by that. Stop fucking blaming people for voting third party. Stop seeking scapegoats on the left just because the fucking DNC told you to. For Christ's sake, don't you see? The DNC is not the progressive left. They're not even center. They're just like a different brand of the same corporatocracy, a different version of the same song, as disgustingly evidenced by this. No, we are the only ones that we have right now. And by we, I mean progressives, the real ones. Because I know a lot of progressives bit the bullet, voted for Clinton, and now want to throw stones at whoever they can find in order to mitigate the anguish that they feel at the Trump presidency. If you need a recap on who is actually to blame, check out last week's episode and then quit firing away in a dark room of your own house and turn the damn lights on. We on the left have to unite. We have an enormous amount of work to do, and we don't have time for sandbox-style tiffs of green versus blue. Step outside the mental confines of parties and focus on people. Unite, and on that same note, that's a train. On that same note, I mean unite across issue barriers as well. If you're a climate justice warrior, join up with the Black Lives Matter movement, and vice versa. We can't afford to be splintered along issue lines. And I'm not saying give up your primary fight. Stay in there and fight, but open yourself up to the people around you that need your help. And be willing to ask them for help, even if you guys don't agree on every damn detail. And this feeds the next point. Recognize your privilege in these fights and recognize your bias. And this isn't just directed towards white people, although we do have a lot of both of those in our corner. But there are levels and varieties of privilege and bias that we need to recognize and come to terms with in order to amp up this fight efficiently. For example, are you pushing for just what makes your life easier? Is that how you vote? Is that how you activate? Or do you recognize that your will to be free, to thrive, is tied to everyone's? Not just in this country, but those under our bombs thousands of miles and several seas away. Challenge yourself to think critically and independently. Oppose your own viewpoints so that you never stagnate in a comfort zone of your own illusions. And finally, don't let up. I know there have been anti-Trump protests around the country, and that's great. But what's next? So he's not your president. Fine. What are we going to do about it outside of arguing the point of his presidency? Let not your presence in the streets after the election be just one quick reactionary shot that then pushes you to check off your activism box and go back to sleep. Stay in that space that makes you angry. Channel that anger and don't let it subside just because you experienced the high, the catharsis of a rowdy night in the streets. Action is nothing without longevity. Keep the movements going and keep the movements growing. And with that, I would like to remind everyone of the challenge that I posed last week of signing up and going to an action or indeed organizing your own. On that note, this week is the anti-TPP resistance week here in DC, and you may be thinking, for those of you that are way in the know, but wait, I heard that shit was dead. Yes, the word has come from on high that they're not going to try for right now with the TPP, and that is a fucking victory. Activists have been battling the TPP for the larger part of 5 years, and this news has not only been hard-won, but it serves as a stunning reminder to all those who look down on dedicated direct action that this shit works. Now, before you call this battle won, let's remember that no battle against corruption is ever really won, and the TPP is likely to be a zombie deal that'll pop up again once the post-election hullabaloo dies down. But for now, despite this great news, there's still a lot of work to do. As Margaret Flowers, co-founder of Flush the TPP and two-time guest on our show, wrote to me, protests are still planned. We will demand an end to this era of rigged corporate trade and a new era of trade that protects people and the planet. We will protest the DAPL on Tuesday, and we will protest the RNC and DNC on Wednesday to say that the plutocracy is over, and the people will now set the political agenda. So there you have it. Make your victory lap the marching route and keep fighting. For those of you not here in DC, there is much to be done in your home, and you can learn more about that at the link below. There are also ongoing actions in solidarity with the Standing Rock resistance, indeed one of which happened here just yesterday, targeting the Army Corps of Engineers. Wherever you are, you can join this solidarity movement by targeting financial or indeed dirty energy institutions involved in the project. For more info on that, visit nodaplsolidarity.org. Now, before we get to this week's guest, I want to play just one more blame game on the ultimate asshole in our problems, overarching capitalism. Capitalist, capital miss, capital this so we can bomb that. Lower so we can be growers, the bell tolls closed, capital shift, capital rift. Here's the chasm, a full market spasm. Which side are you on? Capital gain, let's make it rain. Capital sane, ain't no such thing. Capital pain, that's punishment made. Liberty maimed, justice by name, never deed. Watch you bleed. That's our creed. Be relieved that our greed still believes that you are allowed to be. Capitalist, capital loss. What's the cost? The bottom lines preserve the guise built on fluff, capital lies. You carry bars that make your cells. You carry debt that carves your hell. And in this capital mirage, the sick and tired miss the dire, miss the line that links the fired to the smoking gun. The bottom lines that make the beams upon which our whole system leans are those same bars and rows of debt that keep the people chained and kept. This capital list, this 1% bliss, this list, this capital, your name isn't profitable, your name isn't listed. No capital list, no 1% bliss. Your capital lost. You're the cost of doing business. And this is capitalism. Let us pray. So there we have it. Fuck capitalism. Now we can all come together with that as a basic foundation, yes? And speaking of which, our next guest represents an organization whose whole function rests on the world that we build post-capitalism. The Next System Project is essentially a post-capitalistic research project that brings together theorists, researchers, and activists to not only discuss next systems, but to help implement them. Last week, we spoke with Deputy Director Dana Brown about Next Systems and the challenges and brilliance of bringing people together at this particular time to imagine and create a better world. Take a look.
I think given the political context we're living in the United States right now, there's a strange bit of advantage there because it seems that people are really desperate for change. And I think these recent elections show us that on kind of every side of the political spectrum, it's become more and more apparent to Americans that the system, the political economy that we have doesn't work for them. So despite the fact that we're a large, diverse country and it will always be difficult to bring everybody together, people are really coming out of the woodwork from the traditional kind of organizing standpoint, from unions and student organizations and the climate movement to academics and everyday folks really are looking for answers in a way that I think they haven't been for a long time. So our job is really to listen and to try to find the places where we can bring different voices together and start to hash out the details.
So on that same level, I mean, you mentioned that in a country this big, it's always difficult to maneuver that. And in the video, there were a couple of different people that talked about that local power and community by community and block by block. And this past election really showed us the progressive push from the states. You know, the legalization of marijuana, campaign finance reform, right to die, things like this. And of course, on the federal level, it was a total disaster. So, do you see? I mean, I guess there's a larger question about what we eventually do about the federal government. But do you see this coming together being outside of the paradigm of a federal coming together?
I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think for a while, those of us that have been fighting for deep transformation in our economy have known that in many ways the answers might come from the grassroots up, right? And our organization, I mean, the Next System project grows out of the Democracy Collaborative, whose work is really at the level of communities and municipalities. And we're really hoping to build on the successes that we've had at that level and think about how to scale up. So it makes sense to us that, and especially as you mentioned, with these elections where you see ballot measures on municipal and state levels that recognize the urgency of climate change and more environmentally friendly policies, that really does seem to indicate to me that the solutions will sort of be bubbling up. And I don't know if that means that we can make a country this large and diverse work as a federal system. It might be time to start thinking about what regionalism would look like, or what a group of federated states, kind of a different sort of European Union, might look like on this side of the Atlantic. And I'm sure you've probably seen that the day after the elections, there were already folks in California talking about a Cal exit, and that, you know, that movement had been around before, but I think it brings about a new urgency to people thinking about these issues now.
Yeah, and in that sort of in that same vein, there's been a lot of argument as to what the best route is, even if we're talking about on a more state-centric level. You have this like solar or wind argument, or no, wave power is best, or we need worker-owned co-ops, or screw that, that's still a capitalism offshoot. And so, are there basics? Are there like fundamental pieces that you use to then craft experiments and actions, like a sort of basis to work from with the Next System project?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, part of our response really is that the diversity of this country, the diversity of geographic and political economic needs really does imply a diversity of responses, of solutions. So the Democracy Collaborative's flagship project was really the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland. And it's a model based on the anchoring institutions of a couple of big hospitals and research institutions who we've been working with to do local procurement, and around that have built a set of worker-owned cooperatives that are green industries. With the whole idea is sort of reinvesting in the community, but doing it in a way that teaches people democratic process as worker owners. But even that model, which is being replicated and iterated around the country, has had to change in each of the other cities that we've been been able to do similar projects, because the geography and the demographics of those communities are different. So I think there's sort of by necessity in this country a plurality of solutions. And there are also things that where even if we had the magic bullet, we had the answer, it probably wouldn't be implementable as such tomorrow. And sort of there are these pathways to change where we have to take something, start it, and know that we're less necessarily going to learn in the process. And as sort of the consciousness of the country evolves, we can also evolve those projects.
Right, and of course the idea of just implementing something is it's almost colonial in a sense. It's like, we're just going to implement this, and if you guys don't agree, then that's your problem. In your opinion, is there a way to move forward inside of capitalism, or is capitalism just done for and we need to either shift to another ism, or do we need to just shift away from capitalism and then figure out what we're going to build?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear to us that we need to find a post-capitalist society in which we can live, because we're really dedicated to things like equity and justice and environmental sustainability, which we don't see in capitalism, certainly not in the corporate capitalist society that we have today. That doesn't mean that there aren't things to do in the meantime, right? We have to start making change inside the system that we're in, but hopefully in ways that are sort of non-reformist reforms, right? Like structural changes that can help lay the foundation for what eventually has to be a very different economy. So I think it's that sort of horrible both and tension of we have to have a fairly clear idea of where we're going and understand what that picture looks like and what some of the big institutions in society would ultimately look like in our goal of a future better place. But we have to lay the groundwork in the here and now. So yes, there are still things to be done at the moment. We can't go home and cross our arms and say, well, since the revolution didn't come on Tuesday, I'm done. But at the same time, we do have to be looking at structural differences because, I think that's another thing that unfortunately maybe the liberals learned in this week's election, which is reform hasn't been getting us much of anywhere. It hasn't mattered as much who we elected into office or selected into office as a country. It hasn't mattered how we've tweaked one local ordinance or, shook up a little bit the confirmation of the Congress in different times. At the end of the day, those that are winning are still winning and those that are losing are still losing. So I do think that we need some real alterations in the architecture of the system to ultimately get a system that benefits us all.
So talk a little bit about that as well, because there's, of course, as activists, we understand that justice is not a switch. You don't just walk over and, oh, we're done now. And even with things like the Civil Rights Act or women's rights and things like that, there's no winning. It's a continuous battle. But talk about, particularly after what happened on Wednesday, people are not only disillusioned, but there's this temptation to just despair. Talk about this idea of like moving forward and not being appeased by simple reforms that don't do anything, but also not getting to that despair point when you realize that, wow, it's a lot harder to significantly change something rather than just make little tweaks.
Sure. Well, I think I'm actually really encouraged by millennials and by the strength and the energy of young people. As you can see from the polls and the results of the election, young people, by and large, did not vote for Donald Trump. It's not to say that their vote was for some, beautiful revolutionary imaginary that we're all hoping for, but seeing the strength of the climate justice movement as well and some of the racial justice movement, there's a lot of strength in the voice of young people today in their fight against mounting educational debt. So I think we really do have to look to that energy and think about how we can harness that and put out bold proposals that the country is probably actually ready for. I think we were so often timid on the left for so long in this country, thinking about reforms because we thought they'd be more palatable. But people really are clamoring for change and big time change. So I think we just have to not be afraid of ruffling feathers and getting into difficult discussions and putting kind of audacious things on the table. Recently, we were asked to provide a background paper to a conference on sort of a post-fossil fuel system. And the proposal we put out there is not something that we think is going to happen tomorrow, but it's sort of the kind of thing that we thought people needed to hear to spark real conversation about the magnitude of change that we need. So we proposed that the government could, as a sovereign government, use quantitative easing, which is just a fancy word for saying printing money. We could use that to bail out the planet the way that we have bailed out the banks for years and years. And for half of what we've spent on the Iraq war so far, the U.S. could buy out the top 25 oil gas companies, as well as the remainder of the coal companies, wind them down and replace them with green jobs. that's still, I'm not saying that this is a tiny thing that would be easy. And again, a flip of the switch, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of work. But it's the magnitude of proposal that we really do need to be talking about, because as the climate movement knows, little incremental changes aren't going to cut it at this point. The time was yesterday. So if we're going to start talking about things tomorrow, then we really have to catch up by thinking big.
And sort of circling back to what I initially started with, this idea of bringing people together, the left has a tendency to infight on issues like, well, you're not a vegan, therefore you're not an environmentalist, or you're not this, you're not that, or you don't agree with me on everything, therefore. Talk a little bit about how can we set that aside and really focus not only on the issues at hand, but also allow ourselves to be allies with one another on these variety of issues, because as I see it, the front lines are long and they spread across all of these issues, and we need to be able to be allies to issues that aren't our first issue. Talk a little bit about how the left can really coalesce the way that the right seems to do without any sort of problem.
Again, I wish I had the magic bullet answer there. It's always going to be difficult, but I think that's a kind of soul-searching question for us as a country. And I think we have to remind ourselves that really our strength is in diversity. Our strength as a nation really is as a nation of immigrants, is a nation who is very economically diverse, geographically diverse. The needs and the reality of somebody in rural Iowa are just different than mine in Washington, D.C. And what I should always remember then is that to get ahead with those folks, I have to be open to listening and understanding that their reality really is fairly different than mine. So I think it kind of goes back to that conflict resolution 101 adage that conflict isn't a bad thing, that it's very natural, and that when we're willing to listen to it, it helps us be creative. So again, I think it's that time in our lives when hopefully we're aware that the situation is so critical that instead of the gut reaction of this is why I don't agree with that, or I don't think it's the best path forward and we don't have time, so we can't do that, we got to do this other thing, is to really let any conflict that we do feel kind of be generative, right? Help us be creative and think of, the big kind of proposals that we need to get ourselves out of the ones that face a society right now.
How does direct action play into the framework of the Next System project?
That's a good question. And I don't think that's for me to say. Really, just as a project, we're a research institute. Really, I think we want to see ourselves as resources for and with activists on the street. We want to know, what are the questions that you're asking? How can we provide the data, the arguments? How can we feed each other so that A, we know what's most important to folks and what you're seeing on the street, and B, what can we offer that helps strengthen those arguments? I wish I were the one who had the tactical response for how we get what we need as a society, but I think those are questions best answered by those who are on the front lines. And just as a project, as an institution, that's not who we are, so I don't think we can speak for. But I think that in any significant social or political changes we've seen in history, there's always been a diversity of strategies, and there's been a hand in hand between sort of nonviolent direct action and other strategies. There has been the role of academics and intellectuals and politicians, and the role of students and community organizers, and we probably can't get the scale of change we need without both of those. So, as you mentioned before, it's really about finding the ways that we link up and dialogue with one another, even if we're not using the same tactics or we're not 100% on the same side about the strategy going forward. It's time to say good enough with some things and say, I'm with you because we need to go somewhere, so let's start going. And, again, make the refinements as we go, but just realizing that we don't have time to sit back and twiddle our thumbs until we come up with the plan that's 110% perfect.
So there you have it. So one of the reasons that I thought it important to ask Dana to be on the show is because of the intellectualism at the root of the Next System project. And many people, from activists to journalists to academics, have noted the rampant spread of anti-intellectualism in this country. And indeed, this anti-intellectualism is much to thank for our present state of affairs. The lack of education and intellectualism not only promotes back-asswards thinking, such as racism, sexism, and the arrogant bigotry that fuels them, but it removes critical and independent thinking based on facts and research from the political stage. And once that's removed, you have what we have now. And you have people bringing fucking snowballs into Congress as evidence against climate change. You have neo-fascists supporting the concept of white genocide as if to suggest that A, that's a real fucking thing, and B, racial purity is necessary because anyone that isn't white is inherently dumber than or less capable than a white person. I mean, you really only have to look at the people saying these things to see otherwise. That's the kind of stupid that even duct tape can't fix. And now that brand of stupid, that brand of anti-intellectualism and basic thinking is in charge. And that's why intellectuals are needed. Thinkers are needed. And that's why activists need to be thinkers and thinkers need to be activists. Again, don't just react to something. Think and act. And on that same note, Dana wanted me to mention the Next System project is currently holding an essay contest called What's Your Alternative? You can learn more about that at the link below, and to find out more about the Next System project as a whole, visit the nextsystem.org. Nextsystem.org. It's cold and it's hard to say those words. With that, revolutionaries, we will wrap up this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out The Last Lie to see all the sites mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. My band, Rooftop Revolutionaries, will be doing 2 acoustic shows on Thursday, December 1st at the Laugh Factory in Los Angeles as part of the Redacted Tonight and RT America show there. The first show at 7:30 is sold out, but the second one at 10:30, there are still tickets available. You can hear more about that, bit.ly/LA Redacted. There's also a third show that's happening on December 3rd in Los Angeles. That will be song and spoken word, and that's at ArtShare LA, and you can find more information about all of this at artkillingapathy.com.